Do you have a paranormal encounter you'd like to share with us? Send us an email with your story for a chance of it being featured on Weird World. Delve into 5 more true and terrifying paranormal accounts from the 2010s, revealing glimpses of the ethereal and unexplained. From nighttime horrors to deceased lingering loved ones, abandoned asylum legends to ghostly aromatic enigmas, such stories pull back the veil on the unseen forces that surround us. The Nighttime Visitor. Home alone late one autumn evening in 2018, 25-year-old Megan Hayes was tormented by a malevolent spectral intruder inside her apartment. The horrifying encounter left her so disturbed she moved out the very next day. Megan had just settled into bed around midnight when she heard heavy footsteps enter the apartment, followed by the sound of someone rummaging loudly through her belongings in the living room. Terrified, she cowered under the covers, praying the intruder would leave. Moments later, her bedroom doorknob began to turn slowly. Megan watched paralysed with fear as the door creaked open. In the darkness of the doorway stood the silhouette of a large man, just under 6 feet tall. Though his features were obscured by shadow, she could see he had a muscular build and long hair. He just stood there, silently watching her, the terror too much for Megan to even scream. After an eternity, he turned and slowly walked away, the sound of his heavy footsteps echoing down the hall. Trembling uncontrollably, Megan waited until sunrise, then fled the apartment barefoot in her pyjamas. She went to stay with a friend, vowing never to return to the apartment again. But curiously, when Megan returned later that day to retrieve her belongings, there was no sign of any disturbance ever having taken place. Also puzzling was that her apartment was on the 3rd floor and could only be accessed by other tenants in the building. How her sinister watcher could have entered and exited undetected sent shivers down her spine. For Megan, the only plausible explanation was supernatural. An evil entity had invaded her home, shattering in one night any semblance of safety she would feel within those walls. Joseph. Sarah Clark was puzzled by the strange occurrences plaguing her family's new home ever since they moved to Pasadena, California in 2010. It began with disembodied footsteps heard at night, too heavy to belong to any of her family members. Then doors began closing by themselves, often right in front of the terrified eyes of Sarah and her 2 teenage daughters. Most disturbing of all were the shadowy figures glimpsed at the periphery of their vision, always vanishing when turned to directly. Sarah's husband, Greg, insisted nothing paranormal was happening, blaming all of the strange events on the distressed noises of an old house. That is, until the fateful night of March 19th, 2012. Shortly after midnight, Greg awoke to use the bathroom. While washing his hands, he was startled to see a pale, translucent figure of an elderly woman standing behind him in the mirror's reflection. Greg spun around, but no one was there. Severely shaken, he returned to bed. Just as his racing mind began to calm, an unseen force pressed down heavily onto his chest as he lay there. Greg felt an unspeakable terror wash over him as an evil presence pinned him helplessly to the bed. Mercifully, it ended as quickly as it began. Greg leapt from bed, turned all the lights on, and spent the rest of the night pacing the house. When Sarah awoke the next morning, Greg tearfully confessed what had happened. He could deny it no longer. Some supernatural force was indeed inside their home. Later that week, they summoned a medium who claimed that a malevolent spirit named Joseph dwelled within the residence. Joseph had apparently passed on the property back in 1938 and did not wish to share the home with the living. The medium warned that urgent action was needed to exorcise Joseph before something far worse escalated. Greg and Sarah, being devout Catholics, arranged for a priest to come bless the home. But tragically, the exorcism would come too late. The following Saturday, the family's eldest daughter, 19-year-old Emily, was home alone taking a shower. As she washed off, the bathroom door suddenly flew open. An invisible force seized Emily and, despite her terrified screams, dragged her from the bathroom. Her parents found her 30 minutes later, curled up on the living room floor and weeping, but otherwise unharmed. Deciding their family could endure no more, Greg and Sarah left the home that very day, leaving all their belongings behind. Whatever evil had plagued them did not follow, for once away from that house on Briarwood Lane, the paranormal events ceased. However, the Clark family would be forever scarred by their harrowing encounters with the malevolent spirit Joseph. Messages from beyond. The passing of a loved one is always difficult, but for the Wilson family, their grief was compounded by troubling paranormal events that followed the death of husband and father Michael Wilson in January 2008. Michael had suffered a fatal heart attack while away on a business trip to Milwaukee, Wisconsin. He was only 48 years old. His widow, Julie Wilson, bore the pain as well as she could for the sake of their 12-year-old son, Tom. But 1 year later, mysterious happenings began to unfold, which suggested Michael was trying to communicate with his grieving family from beyond the grave. It started with electrical appliances turning on by themselves in the middle of the night. TVs, radios and lights throughout the home would spontaneously switch on, often just as Julie and Tom were going to sleep. Then Tom began waking up to find his belongings had been put away, lined up neatly on the floor beside his bed. The bizarre events escalated on January 10th, 2009, the 1-year anniversary of Michael's passing. That night, Julie awoke to see her deceased husband's face staring down at her, his stony expression clearly visible in the darkness. She flipped on the light and the phantom image vanished. Then, just as Julie was about to check on Tom, she found several of Michael's old shirts laid out neatly on their bed. Julie knew there had to be a message from her late husband behind these incidents. She shared the story with her sister Courtney, who suggested Julie try communicating back with Michael's spirit using a Ouija board. Julie thought the idea unwise, but nevertheless allowed Courtney to hold a simple séance in her house. During the séance, they were to establish contact with Michael. He said his spirit was restless and that the family needed to visit his grave so that he could tell them something important. The following day, Julie and Tom drove 6 hours back to Michael's burial site in Madison, Wisconsin. When they arrived, Julie felt a sudden breeze rustle through the cemetery, even though the air up until that point and the time after had been and would be still. She knew at that moment Michael's spirit was with them. At his graveside, Julie tearfully told Michael that she and Tom missed him terribly and that they would love to hear his voice again someday in the afterlife. Her heartfelt words seemed to bring closure. On the long drive home, as Tom napped in the back seat, Julie softly heard Michael's voice whisper, "I love you both. Don't worry, we'll meet again." She looked around, stunned, but saw no one. From that day forward, the paranormal occurrences in the Wilson home ceased. Julie and Tom took comfort knowing Michael still watched over them, albeit from a realm not of this earth. The Phantom Physician. When urban explorer Christian Shaw illegally entered the abandoned Greystone mental asylum, he got more than he bargained for, a harrowing glimpse into the facility's tragic and tortured past. Greystone had been closed for 15 years, but Christian was determined to film inside and post the footage on his popular urban exploration blog. At dusk one evening in September 2012, he slipped under the perimeter fence carrying a camera. The massive 150-year-old building loomed in the darkness before him, decaying and ominous. Christian easily gained access through a broken window. He began wandering the maze of corridors and wards, remarking on the eerie atmosphere within. Turning a corner, he unexpectedly came upon the asylum's infamous Room 217. the site of countless instances of patient abuse and neglect. Despite feeling a strange chill in the air, Christian entered and began describing its grisly history for his video. However, at that same moment, the door slammed shut behind him. He tugged desperately on the handle, but it would not budge. Then he heard a sinister voice call out, "Trespasser," followed by footsteps approaching from down the hall. A frantic search for a place to hide ensued as Christian's panic mounted. He quickly squeezed inside a small linen closet just moments before the footsteps entered room 217. Through a crack in the door, he glimpsed a stooped elderly man in a doctor's coat pacing the room, seemingly searching for him. Christian could only assume the frightening figure was the ghost of the former asylum physician known as Dr. Benton, notorious for his cruel experimentation on patients in the very same room. After several agonising minutes, the spirit seemed to give up and shuffled out of the door, allowing Christian to emerge from hiding. He then escaped the asylum unharmed. Local legend states that those who dare encroach on the spirit's dominion often have terrifying encounters inside the decrepit old building, which remains abandoned to this day. Spectral cigarette smoke. David Harcott had just moved into a new house with his wife Grace in the suburbs of Seattle, Washington in the spring of 2019. Little did they know that their cosy new home would soon become the setting for a series of unsettling paranormal occurrences. It started slowly at first. David kept smelling cigarette smoke in various parts of the house, even though neither he nor Grace smoked. The previous owners of the house didn't smoke either. David first noticed the smell one evening while watching TV in the living room. An unmistakable wisp of cigarette smoke drifted past his nose. He looked around bewildered, unable to discern where it was coming from. Over the next few weeks, the spectral smoke kept appearing randomly throughout the home. One day, David would smell it in the kitchen. The next day, it would be present in the master bedroom. Grace also began noticing the odd smell. "Where on earth is that cigarette smoke coming from?" she asked David one day. Neither could fathom any explanation. Things escalated on one fateful night in late May. David and Grace were getting ready for bed when a powerful wave of cigarette smoke flooded the master bedroom, so strong it stung their eyes. The couple fled from the room in confused agitation, but when they returned minutes later, the smoke was gone. At their wits' end, David and Grace called in a paranormal investigator by the name of Paul Murray. Paul inspected the home thoroughly, but found no source for the mysterious smoke. As a last resort, he set up infrared cameras throughout the house to monitor for any strange activity. That very night, the cameras captured astonishing footage. At exactly 3:07 a.m, all the cameras simultaneously detected a dense cloud of cigarette smoke materialising in the living room. It hovered there for a full 5 minutes before vanishing. Bill analysed the footage extensively but could not explain how the smoke appeared so suddenly and in such quantity. For David and Grace, this was the proof they needed that a supernatural presence was indeed haunting their home. They moved out less than a month later, hopeful that whatever spirit was polluting their house with spectral smoke would not follow them to their new home.